Welcome to the Knowledge Gumbo Podcast, where we mix together timeless wisdom and thought provoking stories using quotes, sayings, proverbs, and book passages, primarily by Black women. I'm your curious minded host, Alicia Thomas, who loves gathering wisdom. This is your space for gaining knowledge and having meaningful discussions about history, culture, life lessons with splashes of humor. Let's get cooking. The mere impartation of information is not education. Dr. Carter G. Woodson. Dr. Woodson, often referred to as the father of Black history, was instrumental in the establishment of Negro History Week in 1926, which later evolved into Black History Month. As a teacher, professor, principal, dean of liberal arts, publisher, and researcher, Dr. Woodson emphasized the importance of both vocational and liberal arts education. In my view, Dr. Woodson was the perfect bridge between W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington because he saw the value in both sides of the argument for vocational and for liberal arts. W.E.B. Du Bois' talented 10th philosophies. It's a shame we couldn't come together and find that synergy, that third option, not a compromise between the two, but a higher level and a third option to push our culture forward in that time period. But let's get back to the quote about information and education. There's a difference between just straight information collecting and actual education. It's a difference between absorption and application. We look at it from the standpoint of just imparting information as passive learning, which primarily involves listening to traditional lectures or just reading, where people become receptacles of knowledge rather than co-creators in understanding that information and taking it to the next level. When we look at what is considered active learning or education, it involves people being a direct participant in their own learning process, where we engage with material by having more deeper discussions, where we look at things from a problem-solving point of view. We do hand-on experiments, trying things out. And also, a part of active learning is peer teaching, because if you can teach something, you have a deeper level of knowledge and understanding of that particular subject. But one of the most important things that happens when you do active learning is you learn to think critically. And I think that is what's missing a lot today, and why a lot of people do things that are contrary to their own best interests. It's critical that we break things down and understand things at their base level and then build it back up into something that can push us forward as people, push us forward as a culture. Because when you have someone who thinks critically, they question assumptions. They can connect something to their own concepts, to their own experiences. It makes more sense. They can construct understanding through exploring different ideas, philosophies, different places, different things, to make that education more well-rounded. And when you're an active learner, it leads to better information retention. It leads to deeper understanding, and it leads to, like I said previously, enhanced critical thinking skills, your ability to break things down, to not take things at face value. So, for an example, let's talk about the Tulsa Race Riots of 1921. It's an event that's often either totally not talked about in history or it's become more prevalent recently, added into curricula, because for years, no one talked about it, especially those in Oklahoma. No one said a word about it, even though, especially those that lived through it. But a passive learning approach or just information gathering about the Tulsa riots would tell you something similar like on May 31st to June 1st, 1921, a white mob attacked the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. But if you look at it from an active learning and a critical thinking, you start to ask more deeper questions. Like, why was Greenwood called Black Wall Street? What does that tell us about the economic power and self-sufficiency in the early 20th century? You might come up with a question for what were the underlying social and economic issues or tensions that led to this particular massacre? And why was this event largely absent from history books for decades? And maybe another question might pop into your head to look into is, how does this event impact generational wealth in the Black community? As we look a little deeper into the Greenwood, we know that it was a thriving community of Black-owned businesses, hospitals, banks, theaters, and it challenged what was often thought, or the narrative of the time, that Black Americans were primarily impoverished and dependent during the post-Reconstruction era. We didn't have the finances to grow and become our own in this separate but equal time period. But the Tulsa area proved that to be invalid. The success of the district actually is what made it a target, because these people were advancing despite the separate but equal. And oftentimes they faced violence, and they had to be careful in how they protected what they were able to build. But when we look at the race riot itself, it wasn't just what they started off saying was a white woman being attacked and an angry mob came over and destroyed the area. It was a systematic destruction of Greenwood. It included using private aircrafts that dropped incendiary devices, dropped bombs in Tulsa. It wasn't a spontaneous, it was coordinated assault on those people, on their prosperity, on their land. And understanding this, especially in this context, explains, the ongoing wealth disparities between Blacks today and Blacks back then. Because if you look at it from the standpoint, because during these times, you had people coming up in wealth like, let's say, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies. You had people who were able to build upon wealth and pass it generationally, because even today, we have people that are still living from, J.P. Morgan's family, from John D. Rockefeller's family, from Andrew Carnegie's family. They still have wealth that was built back in that time today, where every time Black people started to grow and respected the law of the land of separate and equal, that didn't sit well with the people on the other side of the tracks, per se. And they had to come over and do something about it because they didn't want these people to not only have financial power, they didn't want them to have political power, because that was one of the things that was leading to this riot as well, is these people were trying to get together and create their own voting blocks to affect the political change on a state level. But if you don't go deeper, if you don't educate yourself, you only learn that these people were wiped out. And when you listen, I've heard different Black entrepreneurs misuse the Tulsa Race riots because they will say that, they should have leveraged other people's money and that they should have been insured. But because they didn't educate themselves, that they didn't look deeper. If you look at the times, white banks didn't loan Black people money. And usually the only way, if you were able to gain it, it was because you had to have a beard, meaning someone who was white or who could pass as white could get them money from white financial institutions. But you had to have a lot of trust in that person because they could also take away your businesses. There are very multiple stories throughout history of that happening to other Blacks as well. And this has long-term effects on why we don't have the level of generational wealth that others do. And the part about the insurance, a lot of these businesses had insurances, but there was a conspiracy throughout the state to not pay out. So these people lost everything and had nothing to rebuild. And in turn, they ended up staying in tent cities after everything was burned down, more like an internment camp for which we were never received reparations, like in World War II, when the Japanese American people were put in internment camps, they received reparations for theirs. So we have to look deeper. Education is very important. It's not just enough to listen to something and take it at face value. And I'm really a big fan of Dr. Woodson. I think reading his book back in college opened my mind to a different way of looking at things, because the things that he was talking about then, you see that we still suffer from now. The book is called The Miseducation of the Negro. I highly recommend that you pick it up and give it a read. It will definitely step on some toes and poke some fingers at some things, and you'll go, wow. Because he was a great academic. He, as I stated earlier, he was a publisher, and he published the Journal of Negro History for several years because he noticed that our stories weren't being recorded and they weren't being told. And he created this company in order to document things, the writings of Black scholars and of women of both African American and the African diaspora history as well. So I would recommend that you either check out those volumes, they're still available to be read, as well as his book, The Miseducation of the Negro. So some, foundational knowledge may need to be conveyed through more traditional methods as far as information gathering. There's a place for both. You don't have to have one over the other, although I believe active learning is the key to our growth personally and our growth as a culture, our growth as a nation, because we see so many people, as I stated previously in other episodes, that vote or move or make decisions that are against their own self-interest because they only hear what they want to hear and they don't go deeper and understand the meaning and what things actually mean. So we have a responsibility for ourselves and for our communities to know more and find that balance between knowing when each area of learning should be applied. Let's look at that quote one more time. The mere imparting of information is not education. One more shout out for Dr. Woodson. He is known as the only person that we know of right now of enslaved parentage to earn a PhD in history from any institution in the United States. So he was always going deeper. Let's look at our challenge for this week. Share below and apply one lesson you learned this week. It doesn't matter if it came from something you learned from a podcast like this one, whether it's from a book you read, whether it's from an interview you watched, it could be another YouTube video. Your mind should always be firing. It should always be functioning, always be learning and taking one thing and applying it. It does no good and I had to kind of make this adjustment myself because I am a voracious reader and I will just consume and consume and consume. And I had to force myself to slow down and take at least one thing from every book I read and apply it to some aspect of my life. So I'm challenging you to do this for yourself. You will be a better person for it. Even if you only apply one thing a month from something that you've learned, that's still 12 new things every year. And the more you apply, the richer and more fuller that your life becomes. It's not enough just to absorb. We have to understand. We have to use what's there and help ourselves grow and become more and do more, to just not stay stagnant. Because if you think about it, that's why a lot of people die right after they retire. Because now they're not doing anything, they're not being active, they're not being engaging, they're not learning, they're not teaching, they're not growing. So your body is like, hey, if you're not being a producer, and in some instances, even when people are retired, they're not consuming either, their body shuts down. Think about that. I want to thank you for listening and or watching. And in exchange for the value you received from this episode, share it with 5 people. Help us to get to our goal of 1,000 subscribers by June 1st. But remember, pull up a chair. There's always room at the table, and you are always welcome. The gumbo is hot and made with love. We'll see you next week.